With the Tara Greenblatt Band. Thank you so much for listening to us. So, we got we want to make sure you can hear it, so we're going to play a song called Can You Hear It? What? He's funny. Yep. 1, 2, 3. Beginner's mind with each new day. When I wake up, I listen carefully to the little birds and the swaying tree, to the hum between you and me, tenderness in every breath, gratitude in every step. This good earth keeps me alive. I owe the world the joy I feel inside. Can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you hear it too? Can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you hear it too? I listen. There is a pulse, a rhythm, energizing everything, even us human beings, playing each soul like a plucked string. I'm listening. Just membranes vibrating, tuning into frequency, buzzing like little bees. I'm singing you, you're singing me. I'm singing you, yeah, you're singing me. I'm singing you. You're singing me. I'm listening. Oh, can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you hear it too? Can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you hear it too? Oh, can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you hear it too? Can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you hear it too? Thanks. It's been hot a long time, hasn't it? Too long. I just got back from Croton, New York, and I heard it rained last night here. Is that true? Did you go outside and dance in it? And celebrate and do the rain dance? That's good. Yeah, you can't really tell today. It looks like it feels like you're walking through rain that won't fall. And it's flat. Well, I hope we're bringing you a little bit of joy. I'll try to take your mind off of it. We have a song about an occurrence in nature. I'm going to stand up for it. I'd like to introduce the bassist. His name is Ramsey Thomas. That's Ramsey Thomas. And I'd like to introduce the guitarist, and his name is Lou Eastman. We're the Tara Greenblatt Band.
And that's Tara Greenblatt.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm Tara Greenblatt.
And this is the band.
This is, yeah. You guys are you, we're us. Here we go. Try to figure out what this song's about. Stopped by your house, but you weren't there. I guess you took your business elsewhere. A change of face, new residence. I can't track you down, there's no address. I see some holes and dangling strands, too weak to hold your victim. Oh, yeah. I caught for you something to eat, just how you like it, with legs and wings. I scooped it right up into my hand, and I come by to toss it into your well. But I'll have to let it go, 'cause here I am, and you're not home. Oh, oh, is all you do every day. Just wait and weave away. And when the air blows, oh, it's all repair, repair, repair. So off you go. Oh, make me swoon, little weaver, with the way you spin that wriggling little bug inside your stomach till it's mummified and stung. It's all over, snap of a finger, no way out of mercy either. You're a graceful, lethal, menacing hunter, and I'm so glad I'm not that grasshopper. I'm so glad I'm not that grasshopper. Yeah, I'm so glad I'm not that grasshopper. I'm so glad. Ooh, must have been the wind and the rain. Yeah. Oh, listen to the wind and the rain. Yeah. Oh, listen to the wind and the rain. Yeah. Oh, must have been the wind and the rain. Thank you so much. All right, well. Every act is about love, isn't it? That's what we hope for. That's what we aspire to do. We act out of love. This is a song that wonders, like, what if love were a being, a creature, an entity? What would it do as it moves through us? What would it make us do? As I adjust my microphone in a complicated manner. What would love do? but the whole world comes crumbling down. Pick a trouble in the world and ask out loud, what would love do right here, right now? What would love do? 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 What if love drove our decisions? What if love gushed from the bottom of the ocean? What if it led our leaders' tongues? What if it could feed the hungry ones? Close your eyes and try on this. Be a brave being and let love in. Come on, step aside and let love take a spin. Drop to your knees and beg the question. What would love do? 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 Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that lifted your spirits right up. Wonderful. All right. So I try to bring the joy. There's enough for the other stuff. And I got a song called Lift My Skirt. So, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Sometimes I forget the basics, excuse me. So, Lift My Skirt is actually written about, for the purpose of what's going to happen tomorrow. Tomorrow is not promised to us. So how about right now? What are we going to do? And it also comes from a minor Grecian goddess she was actually known as a midwife in the ancient Greek mythology, and normally presented as a very old woman. And the way she settled, she was a dispute settler by shocking people. She would shock people by lifting her skirt. And in fact, funny, it is. And it's also a really radical, powerful thing to do. To bring the feminine into the situation and force it in and force everybody to stop and be arrested by the beginning of all things, which is where everything starts, isn't it? So this is what that goddess kind of represented. And this is a song about a family member who was diagnosed with breast cancer and said, life is like Russian roulette. You don't know what you're going to get, so you might as well live for today. Okay. Slow tempo. 1, 2, 3, and. I got to be awake, I got to be alive, 'cause there's only so much time. I gotta forgive, I gotta let go, 'cause I don't know about tomorrow. I got to unzipper, I gotta undress, I gotta dance all up in this mess, 'cause I don't know what the future holds. I gotta give all I got to this world, 'cause I don't know what the future holds. I gotta feel what the world's got to give me. La ba 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 dee ba da ba, ba ba da ba I gotta lift my skirt, roll around in the dirt, yeah. Chase the bees to the honeycomb. I gotta die right in there, saint or sinner, sweet or sour, it don't matter the kind. I pour it on thickly, I drink it up quickly, yeah. Oh, the stinger from my finger like so. Oh, I gotta be awake, I got to be alive, 'cause there's only so much time. I'm too good to waste on missing out on what I might find. Time too good to waste on missing out on what I might find. I gotta know what the future holds, yeah. I gotta give all I got to this world. I don't know what the future holds. I gotta feel what the world's got to give me, 'cause I don't know what the future holds. I gotta give what I got to this world, 'cause I don't know what the future holds. I gotta give all I got to this world, yeah. Thank you. All right. Whew. How's everyone doing? Good. No, you're sort of walled in, but we're making some holy space, right? That's what we're doing. Art, where art and the divine meet. Okay. We have just a couple more for you. I didn't bring water up. I don't know if somebody from the house wants to bring me up a cup of water. I'm not trying to buy time. I just have no water with me. Anyway, we're going to sing a song called Flocks and Shoals. Water's coming. Flocks and Shoals is all about water and the sky.
And birds.
And birds, yes. What is above is also below. I like to write songs that are about the macro and the microcosms that mirror each other. I have a few songs about that, and this is one of them. Maybe not. All right, I'll live with it. So,
Yes.
Here it comes.
to the rescue. Fantastic. Oh, hi. That's okay. Thank you, Pam. Appreciate it. Well, Flocks and Shoals, here we go. pencil tip dots, hundreds of birds, all in one motion, dipping and turning. Black and white cards thrown into the wind, flapping their wings in perfect unison. Hovering blah, it moves up and down, swelling, deflating, fast motion cloud. How do they do that? Who is the leader? They're all calibrated to one cosmic meter. All holds my breath behind my lips. I can't exhale, my eyes drip. Oh, reverence washes over me. That's what the word holy means. That's what the word holy means. That's how the word holy feels. Well, in the ocean, a little below them, shoals of fish, a perfect reflection. Glitter suspended in wave after wave. When I reach out, they bend away. Shards of shattered mirror, floating crazy water, disorienting. How do they do that? Neurotransmitters, they're all calibrated to some cosmic meter. Oh, holds my breath behind my lips. I can't exhale, my eyes drip. Oh, reverence washes over me. That's what the word holy means. That's what the word holy means. That's how the word holy feels. Floods and shoals, a mirror above and below. Floods and shoals, a mirror above and below. Ooh, floods and shoals. Floods and shoals, a mirror above and below. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ramsey Thomas, Louise Min, Tara. Tara, good luck, Ann. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Corinne Chronopoulos, your moderator for today. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Monadnock Summer Lyceum with today's guest speaker, Joyce Maynard.
Before we get started, I'd like to thank today's musicians, the Tara Greenblatt Band, for providing the music. We thank them for providing the music many of you enjoyed while waiting for the live broadcast to begin. Also, thank you to the Reading Foundation for generously sponsoring today's event, and to McDowell for the beautiful flowers. For many years, the Monadnock Summer Lyceum has brought outstanding world-class speakers to the Monadnock region to serve as catalysts to inform, engage, and inspire an active citizenry on local, national, and global issues. Today's talk is being recorded and will soon be available as a podcast and as a video on our website, monadnocklyceum.org. Programs are rebroadcast on WSMN 1590 AM the following Sunday at 10 a.m. and on WUML 91.5 FM the following Wednesday at 11 a.m. and the following Sunday at 3 p.m. As is the tradition of the Lyceum, after the presentation, our speaker will answer questions from the audience. Those present in the meeting house may write your questions on the yellow card in the pew in front of you, and an usher will come around to collect them. For those watching virtually, please submit your questions by using the live comments section on YouTube. The Monadnock Summer Lyceum is supported entirely through contributions from our audience members. We deeply appreciate your donations, which may be placed in the glass bowls in the church and in the parish hall. Those listening at home may make contributions on our website or by mailing your donation. Thank you so much for your generous support. In your pew, you will find a green card. We hope you will give us feedback on today's program and join our mailing list. You can either mail the green card to us or drop it in the bowls, either alone or with your contribution. For those watching virtually, you may provide feedback on today's program, suggestions for next summer's speakers, make a donation, or join our mailing list through our website. Following the program, we invite you to attend an informal reception in the parish hall to my right, through the door to my right. During the talk, if anyone would like a glass of water, please raise your hand and an usher will bring you water. Our speaker today is Joyce Maynard. Maynard is a mother, daughter, sister, mentor, writer, and so much more than any of these descriptors. Above all, she is an explorer of the human voice. She has spent her lifetime discovering and sharing her own voice, and as a teacher and mentor, utilized her talent and encouragement to help others find theirs. From the time she was a child, Maynard was a writer, sending off articles and essays and meeting early success with her work published in 17 and the New York Times Magazine. She is a fellow of Yaddo and McDowell. She's dedicated her life to the craft, publishing 18 books, both works of fiction and nonfiction. Her work has been featured in The New Yorker, Vogue, on NPR, and as a performer on The Moth. Her latest book, Count the Ways, was described by Joyce Carol Oates as fearlessly candid and heart-rendingly forthright. Maynard is currently at work on a sequel. For over 20 years, she has hosted a week-long workshop right by the lake at her part-time home on the shores of Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, where she mentors writers in the art and craft of telling their story. In reading Maynard's work, I was reminded of a line from a poem by Elizabeth Alexander. It reads, "Poetry is the human voice, and are we not of interest to each other? Today we are thrilled to listen further to a great American writer who is certainly of interest to us all. Welcome, Joyce Maynard."
It is such a particular gift to be with you this morning. I speak in lots of places, but when I'm speaking in New Hampshire, I've come home. I grew up on the seacoast, but really my adopted home for many years has been, not sure if we have sound. Are we okay? Yeah. My adopted home has been the Monadnock region. And a lot of my history has been lived here, from taking my children up Mount Monadnock when they were 2 and 4 and 8, a little young for the 2-year-old, but we made it to the top. My father lived here at the end of his life, and I wrote my novel Labor Day at MacDowell, a place that I continue to revere as a gift to artists, and I have been lucky enough to be one of them there. And now I live in the summers just down the road. I left New Hampshire over 25 years ago, and I thought I was done with winter and some other rough parts about living in New Hampshire, but it has a way of pulling you back, and here I am, back again. So, although I've written 18 books and more novels than memoir, the subject that I always want to share has to do with telling one story. And I'm a little bit of a crusader for the experience of doing it, whether you call yourself a writer or not. One of my passions in life has been mentoring people who may not think that they can write in the telling of the one story that nobody else can tell better than you, and that's the one that you own, the one that you have lived. And I come to that experience as somebody who had a hard time claiming her own story, and I thought I would begin by giving you a little bit of that history. I grew up in Durham, the daughter of 2 brilliant and passionate lovers of language. My father was an artist, a painter, and taught at the University of New Hampshire. My mother was the daughter, and he was the son of Christian missionaries raised in India, actually, who was raised on the Bible, and the language of the Bible was embedded in his speech. My mother was the daughter of Russian immigrant Jews who came to Canada in the 1920s. She was the first person in her family to go to college, and she was a brilliant student. She went to college in Manitoba, Canada, then graduate school, and eventually went to Radcliffe, Harvard, where she earned a PhD, and then, like so many of the wives and mothers of the 1950s, she could not get a job because she was a woman. And so her artwork became her children, and she raised both my sister and me to be writers and to have the careers that she had been unable to have. Although in the end she got it in her late 50s. So there was no time that I didn't know that it was my job to write and to lay at my parents' feet a kind of acknowledgement that had eluded them. I've often said, before I could actually physically write, I gave dictation, and my mother wrote down my stories and mailed them in to magazines that some of you are old enough to remember, Humpty Dumpty, and Junior Scholastic, which was where I was first published. And she taught me, it was she who taught me the lesson that there was a story that I had to tell that was important. I remember coming home from school one day, and something that seemed like a tragedy had occurred when I was about 8 years old, an 8-year-old's idea of a very hard thing. And she said, "At least you can write about it." And those words, my mother's been dead over 30 years now, those words continue to inform me as a writer, that when experience, often hard experience, takes place, especially hard experience, that is the moment to make art of it, to make something of meaning, so it will not simply be a crushing devastation. When I was 18 years old, I went off to Yale University. It was the 3rd year that women were admitted to Yale, 1971. And because I was this wildly ambitious girl who wanted to redeem my mother's lack of acknowledgement in her own career life, I mailed off a letter to the editor-in-chief of the New York Times and said, "I think I should write for you." You kind of have to be 18 years old to do this. And interestingly, he wrote back and said, "Okay," and he gave me an assignment to write the only story I was equipped to write at 18, which was my own story. He said, why don't you write about growing up in the 60s? So I got out my yellow legal pad and I worked all weekend and read my story out loud to my parents. I hitchhiked home from New Haven to do so and typed up my story, mailed it off to the New York Times. They accepted it, sent a photographer to take my picture, and about 6 weeks later, there I was in full color in my blue jeans on the cover of the New York Times Magazine section with a story. I completely missed the irony of the title of this story. It was called An 18-Year-Old Looks Back on Life. I will never be able to lie about my age because on April 23rd, 1972, I was identified as 18. You can do the math. That was 50 years ago. I'm 68. So my world changed overnight at this point. And all the kinds of small town frustration, I wanted to get to New York City and publish my work and, go on Broadway and be in the movies. Not sure, but this is a better microphone, I guess. Within 2 days of the publication of that story, there were 2 enormous sacks of mail on the steps of my Yale dormitory room with over 1,000 letters. And they were things like invitations to come and meet editors and publishers and magazine people and radio people and go on television and model clothes for Mademoiselle magazine. My favorite of the offers actually was an invitation to audition for The Exorcist. Obviously, I didn't get the part, but I tried. In among those letters was one totally different from all the others. One page, single-space typewritten, that said, Dear Miss Maynard. I won't quote you the whole letter, but it was a fairly memorable one, telling me that the author of this letter recognized me as a real writer and respected my work and wanted to issue words of caution. I would be exploited. There's a certain irony in this story. But he went on to say that he knew a thing or two about early success in publication, and he urged me to be careful. He said some things that connected me to him long before I got to the signature. He too was living in New Hampshire. He too was this half-Jewish person who inhabited 2 very different worlds. And when I got to the signature, it was not the signature that moved me. It was the sentiments and the feeling that I had found for the first time in my life, a person who understood me in a unique and unprecedented way. But the signature was that of J.D. Salinger, who even in 1972 was already famously a hermit. I embarked on a correspondence with him that basically eclipsed the rest of my world, and Yale and my friends and my activities and my classes there no longer mattered. The first thing I did when school got out in the spring, by this time I had actually signed a contract to publish my first book, ostensibly a memoir, to be published very fast before I got to be too old, meaning 19. I went to meet Salinger, and within weeks I had given up my very good summer job at the New York Times. I'd given up my full scholarship to Yale. I had moved in with him, believing, as an 18-year-old does, who worships somebody, that we would be together forever. We were not. And a year later, on a trip to Florida, he put a $50 bill in my hands and said, go back home, clear all your things out of my house, and disappear. If any man said these things to me today, I'd think less of the man. But as my 19-year-old self, I thought that I had failed. And for many years after that, I continued the belief that I had failed to be good enough for the great man. I also knew that it was my responsibility and obligation to never tell the story of what happened. And for 25 years, I never did. I continued my life as a writer. I married an age-appropriate man, had children, had an age-appropriate divorce. But there was one story that I never told, and it was the story of what had changed my life utterly, the devastation that I had experienced when I was 18 years old. When my daughter turned 18, suddenly I revisited that experience and I looked at it completely differently. And where I had always believed, as so many women do, that it was my responsibility to protect the great man, I imagined now the 18-year-old girl who did not receive protection. And I gave myself permission to do the simplest thing, the simplest and most complicated thing, which was to tell my own story. Not a story told in vengeance or rage, but simply to tell the truth of what had happened that had shaped my life. I wrote a book that was published in 1998 called At Home in the World. And if you were reading book reviews in the fall of 1998, you would have heard just about every terrible word applied to, not even to my book, but to me personally. I was referred to in the pages of the New York Times as a predator, a person who had exploited a great and pure man who just wanted to be left alone. This was obviously, for the young people in this room, pre-Me Too. The idea had not yet been voiced that a woman had a right to tell a story about even a very famous and important man, that her story also mattered. That book cost me greatly in my personal and career life. I became a canceled writer for many years, and really couldn't publish a book, couldn't get a contract, and I took on what at first seemed like just a default career. I decided I would teach the art of memoir. I would help other women to tell their stories. And I've been doing that now for almost 30 years. I've taught hundreds and hundreds of women, and sometimes men. Men are always welcome, in the telling of their stories. And I have heard hundreds of women, and sometimes men, share stories that they never shared with anyone before. They often begin by saying, well, I'm not really a writer. I've never published anything, or whatever the definition of a writer is in their world. But even though I did eventually rebuild a career, and I've published many books since At Home in the World, none of which have anything to do with the great man who was a part of that memoir, I would name as probably the most fulfilling part of my life the experience of watching women and men unburden themselves of a forbidden story and what happens when they do. Sometimes they've published it, and it's great when they do, but I never use that as the measure of success. I simply know what happens and how a person is changed when she or he or they is able to tell the truth of their story. And it's a terrifying thing for many people to do that. We've been told to be nice, to be polite, women in particular, to think of everybody else's needs before our own. For me, the telling of that story, as costly as it was for many years in my career life, and as costly as it still is in some ways, I know if I live another 30 years, what will be said in my obituary is, when she was 18 years old, she slept with a famous man. We know this. It's not the most important thing in my life, but I have recognized that one of the gifts of that experience, and I try to locate gifts in hard experience, is to help other people. And that's one of the big reasons why I'm here. So I'm going to, actually, we're saving a little more time than usual for questions, and I hope that people feel very free to ask them. But I'm going to share with you now a completely different story, a few pages from my most recent memoir. But the book that was published most recently was a novel called Count the Ways, set in New Hampshire, actually. I highly recommend it. But the book before that was a memoir about, it's a memoir called The Best of Us, and it's about finding and losing my very good second husband, Jim, whom I met when I was 57 years old, married when I was 59, and lost him a year and a half later when he was just 64. That was 6 years ago. And I'm going to read you a few pages from The Best of Us. I want to say that my work is usually published in France, and often I love the French titles of the books. The French always give a different title to the book, and I love the title that the French publishers gave to The Best of Us. My husband, as he was dying of pancreatic cancer, said to me, probably about 6 weeks before he died, Jim said, and Jim was a very private man. He said, "One day you will tell this story." In French, it is "Un jour tu raconteras cette histoire," and that's the name of the book in French. So here is my way of honoring pain and trying to make art out of it, or at least acknowledge that something important and difficult happened, and to talk about it. Here's what happens when you love someone a great deal and he gets sick and then he dies. All those months you spent taking care of him, it was almost as if the two of you were one person. He was the one with cancer, but the pain consumed you both. You were off in the North Atlantic somewhere, stranded on an iceberg, and though it was brutally cold in that place, and every single thing about being there was hard, you were together on your iceberg. There was hardly one thing that took place that you did not share. Then your iceberg broke in two. You floated off in one direction, he in another. And though the place you ended up is a warmer one, with sailboats passing by, their bright flags fluttering in the breeze, and people waving and calling out to you, sunshine again, and maybe even porpoises circling with their smiling faces, your fellow traveler has disappeared. His iceberg melted away with him on it. New things are happening now that you experience and he does not. Some wonderful, some awful. What would Jim have thought about the election of Donald Trump? That would have killed him, I said to a friend the morning after, if he wasn't already dead. Maybe this is what people mean when they say, life goes on. This is the good news and the terrible. It began that summer, this process of drifting out to sea. It doesn't mean you cease loving the person who left. Everything you had and everything that happened remains with you. Life doesn't stop, is all. Not yet, anyway. A few days after Jim's death, just as the sun was coming up, my son brought me to the Oakland airport, where I got on a plane headed for Manchester, New Hampshire. It was July now. It was this event that brought me back to New Hampshire. It was July now, my wedding anniversary, and like that day, just 3 years earlier, the sky was cloudless. From my seat on the airplane, the sun had come through the window at just the right angle to catch my wedding ring, reflecting little flecks of light that sparkled on the wall of the plane and the armrest and the back of the seat in front of me like stars. When I moved my hand, the sparkles moved with me as if something magic were happening here. Wherever my hand went for that brief moment when the sun hit my ring, sparkles encircled me. Maybe this was why men gave diamonds to women they loved, so there was no chance ever you'd forget them. So they'd come to you at odd moments like this one. Well, the giver of this ring came to me all the time and would have regardless. And when they did, you'd be enveloped in stars. My friend Danny picked me up at the airport that afternoon. It was close to sunset, but he knew where I wanted to go. First, to the cottage I'd bought, sight unseen, that winter, just down the road. Guess what, sweetheart, I'd told Jim over dinner that night. I bought a house on a lake in New Hampshire, 10 miles down the road from where Audrey lives. never one to question my wilder choices or to suggest that I was capable of anything less than all I aspired to, Jim had said, "That's great, baby." Later that summer, many things would happen. I would pick blueberries with my daughter and make it to the top of Mount Monadnock again, the one I had climbed 4 times with Jim. I would paint the front door of the lake cottage yellow and tear down a wall to let the sun into the kitchen and drive to Maine one weekend to see Becky at the place where Jim and I had made our annual pilgrimage for corn on the cob and pie, and out on the screen porch watching the sun disappear over the water and listening to her son recite the legend of Sam McGee while we polished off a bottle of Zinfandel. I'd attach a picture to the refrigerator from the summer of our wedding 3 years back of Jim at the Madison Hut in the White Mountains of New Hampshire at the end of that long, hard day we'd tackled Mount Adams, his green bandana not quite covering that great head of hair, with a smile that suggested there was not one thing in the world he wanted more of life than what was in his grasp at this one perfect moment. All that summer, I'd sleep in the boathouse, in the bed I brought down from the main house, a single bed, but if Jim were here, we could have shared it. All that summer, with the exception of the one weekend I'd driven to Maine, I would get up at 5:30 every morning. After my swim and my coffee, I'd spend my day at the little desk I'd set up in that boathouse, retracing our story. I recognized as I did this that I was reluctant to get to the end, as if, so long as I hadn't reached the last chapter, it might still turn out differently. You know, I mentioned 2 memoirs of mine. I've actually published 3 memoirs and hundreds of essays, but 3 books that were officially called memoirs. The first was the one that those eager editors signed me up to write, and write fast, when I was 18. It's a book called Looking Back. And I never call that a memoir because I was still writing to please. I was still telling the easy, comfortable story. So when I wrote about growing up in the 60s, I wrote about seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show and protesting the war in Vietnam as a teenager. I did not write the hard stories, the truest stories. I never wrote about the fact that while I was writing that book, I was living in the home of a 53-year-old man who happened to be J.D. Salinger. I never wrote about the fact that I, this anointed youth spokesperson of 1972, this all-American girl, had grown up in an alcoholic family. I never spoke of the fact that every night my father got drunk, and every morning we pretended it never happened. My father, whom I adored. The book was dedicated to my parents, and my desire and my sense of obligation was to please them. And though I would never want to hurt anyone I loved, my goal as a writer has changed. And my goal as a writer now is to tell the difficult and true stories, and the stories that I'm hoping will leave a reader feeling less alone. When I was growing up in Durham, New Hampshire, in that house on Madbury Road, where my father climbed the stairs to our attic every night and made paintings through the night and drank vodka, I didn't know anybody else's father got drunk. I didn't know that was a thing that happened. And I was hugely invested in my responsibility to keep the secret. Same as, some years later, I felt it was my obligation to keep the secret of an important man who liked to write letters to teenage girls. What I believe now is that it is the best thing we can do to tell those difficult stories that some people can't tell. And I recognize that it's part of my job as a writer to talk about things that some people can't talk about and help them to feel less alone. by doing that. And it was definitely my parents, most of all my mother, who imparted those tools to me. I'm a college dropout. I left Yale when I was 18. I did go briefly back when I was 65, and I loved being back at Yale at the age of 65, and did 2.5 great years there until COVID kind of shut things down for me. But I got a second round of my education, but nobody ever taught me better than my mother how to tell a story. And I want to tell you a story that will perhaps convey some of this. When I was living in Hillsborough, a young mother, my first marriage, married to the father of my children, my mother came to visit. I would never have dreamed that I would lose her just a few years later. She died when she was younger than I am now. We went out to dinner together to a little restaurant that no longer exists, but a total like old Yankee, very proper kind of place. My mother, there was nothing proper about my mother. My mother was a wild woman, and she had a big voice and a big laugh and a huge zest for life. So we're sitting, and she was never really a small town Yankee restaurant, polite behavior kind of a person. So we're sitting in this restaurant. I had brought a friend along because I actually wanted to explain my mother to my friend, and I didn't know how I could do it without saying, there she is, Exhibit A. So my mother was regaling us with a story, the great gift of my childhood, her stories. And she was telling this story in her big voice, with her big laugh and her great delivery, and she really knew how to tell a story. And suddenly, I looked around the restaurant. It was dead quiet. Every table had stopped their conversation. I won't say that I ever again went to a restaurant like that with my mother, but the next day, my friend said she was at the bank and somebody came up to her and said, "Who was that woman and where can we find her again?" So when I teach, I think of her, and when I speak and urge others to tell their story. And one of the stories that I've ended up telling, because actually At Home in the World was finally not a book about J.D. Salinger. It was, as every good memoir is, a book about the girl whose life was changed by him and by other people as well. My mother is probably the most important additional character in that story. When I tell these stories, and when I work with writers who are trying to do the same, I urge them to be fearless and unblinking, and to trust that if they felt love and compassion for their characters, as flawed as they all are, so will the reader. I have been lucky enough to publish my work for over 50 years, and in doing so, I recognize again and again the capacity for understanding and compassion of readers. And it has made me brave. It has made me brave in the telling of my stories to know that far from feeling shamed and far from being excluded by telling the hard stories, it is the hard stories that will most deeply connect us, because we all have them. I can always go on talking. I am my mother's daughter, but what I really love best is to hear from you and to the people in the listening audience as well. And I think, Corinne, you're going to start out with a question.
Well, I want to start by thanking you, Joyce, for your insightful thoughts on the story only you can tell. So we do have time for questions. For those watching virtually, please submit your questions by using the live comment section on Facebook or YouTube. While the ushers collect the yellow cards, I'll begin by asking you a question.
Yeah.
You have given this advice to writers: write like an orphan. Can you speak to that sentiment, and do you have any advice about writing as a parent?
Writing as a parent. And so we've already heard a little bit about the fact that, in fact, I am an orphan, so I can write like an orphan without a huge leap of imagination. But what I mean, of course, by writing like an orphan is that as a writer, you need to put aside the admirable impulse to be protective and tell the truth. And even if your truth is so searing that you could never share it anywhere, the simple act of telling it will be an important experience in your life. So there's write like an orphan. Write fearlessly, unblinkingly, and do not tiptoe around the difficult stuff, because the difficult stuff is the part that's almost certainly the most important. Having said that, I don't just play fast and loose with the lives of everybody who I have encountered in my own 68 years on Earth. And I have a very particular code for the stories I cannot tell. And mostly those involve children. I was absolutely excoriated, condemned in 1998, and I have been again since, for writing about a famous and important man who chose to send me letters and invite me to drop out of college and be with him. I didn't feel any need to protect him. But children do not choose, do not have the same kinds of choice in their presence in our lives. And when my children were very young, I wrote a newspaper column. It was syndicated for many years. It was called Domestic Affairs, and it ran in papers all over the country. And my children were then very little. My son Willie had actually just been born. He's now 38, so you can do the math. And I felt it was really important as a person who had grown up feeling like such an outsider because my family didn't look like other people's families, and I was ashamed of that fact. I wanted to tell true stories about family life. My story ended up including the breakdown of my marriage and my becoming a single parent. Interestingly, in the year 1989, when my marriage ended, half of the newspapers that ran that column dropped it, saying that I was no longer, as a divorced person, I was no longer qualified to write about family. That was not ancient history. But when my children reached their teenage years, it no longer seemed like a good idea for their lives to be portrayed in the pages of newspapers. And that's really when I became a fiction writer. The new novel, Count the Ways, which is my 10th novel, and I think my best, addresses many themes and experiences that come from my life. And I think any honest fiction writer will tell you the same. If you read all the books of John Irving, if you read all the books of, I could name all of my favorite fiction writers, they are filled with the obsessions of those writers. But there is a kind of distance that fiction provides. So in Count the Ways, I was able to write about a family like the one that I raised. It follows 4 generations of a family living on a farm in New Hampshire, 3 children, and the death of that marriage, and a terrible family tragedy that pretty much destroys the marriage. It's not a true story, but I'm always flattered when somebody says, did that really happen? Because that means I've done my job right. So fiction has been for me a way to continue to explore the kinds of themes, and they often have to do with children, that I couldn't in my memoir. But there's a lot that I still can and do explore in my memoir.
Thank you, Joyce. A question from the audience. Where do you find the bravery to tell the difficult stories? The tension between having a voice that is demanding to be heard and the desire for privacy?
You know, it's so interesting. I have never found keeping a secret to be the safe place. And I know this goes back to growing up in an alcoholic family. The scary thing to me was not simply my father's drinking, but that we never talked about it. That was probably the harder thing. If we had ever been able to acknowledge it was going on, I would have felt so much less afraid and so much less ashamed. So to me, strength and courage and a sense of well-being comes from naming the problem. You know, if you think there's a monster under the bed, or if your child does, look under the bed, shine a light under the bed. Where I find the courage, I guess from you, from the fact that I've been publishing my work for 50 years. I have no doubt there are people for whom I am not their type of person and who think that the word oversharing has been applied to me many times. I'm not sure what the correct amount of sharing is, but evidently I've exceeded it many times. But I have found myself confirmed again and again by the experience of readers saying, "Me too, I get it, you're not alone." And I always do ask writers that I work with, what's the worst that could happen? What would be the worst thing that could happen? There was a woman who wrote to me a while back, and she said, "My sister is a very advanced alcoholic. She has cirrhosis. She is probably going to die if she doesn't stop drinking. I want to write about the experience of having a deeply loved sister who gets up every morning and starts drinking, but I don't want to offend her." Well, her death will offend her. The truth, the shining of the light, may be the only way that some kind of honest communication can occur. And this is, an old saying from AA that you cannot change the behavior of others, but you can only change your own. And I never feel that everybody else has to go and write an honest memoir. I'm simply saying that for me, that works. And when you tell your truth, the people around you have a way of shifting as well.
A member of the audience asks about your process. Are your acute details, such as the sun coming through the airplane window and hitting your ring, is that from a daily journal, or is this just memory looking back?
Well, of course, I continued to have that ring, so the experience of those sparkles, in the case of that one, was indelible. But if you've lived your life as a writer, as I have, you go through life noticing. I'm never really off duty, I have to say, and that's okay because I love my work. So no, I don't keep a journal. I don't take notes on my experience. I did when Jim was very ill. I did have a notebook that I kept in the hospital of just the various things that happened. But what I actually believe is the stuff that matters, we don't need to write down. We do remember that.
If you could go back in time, would you still have the experience of connecting and living with Salinger, or would you not walk through that particular fire?
I bet everybody in this room could substitute a question that would apply to them of a difficult experience that happened and that altered their life. And what if they hadn't done that? And in some cases, if I hadn't gotten into that car drunk, well, we know that would have been a better thing to not do. I don't go down those roads because every road that I did take led me to here. So was it a good idea for an 18-year-old girl to give up her life to become the student of and worshiper of a very powerful man, 35 years older than her, who basically said, "Don't communicate with anybody in the world for a year"? No, but what other difficult things might have happened during that year? So I don't go down that one. But it's a good question.
Here's a question you'll like, Joyce. A member from our audience asks, could you talk about pie crust as a metaphor for life?
So, a few of you may know that one of the things I do is I teach pie. And I actually do it, I'll tell you very briefly how I came to teach pie. My mother was living in Toronto, had made a very good second marriage, was having a great life. She had actually published 2 books by this time. She had a TV show in Toronto. She was having a great life when all of a sudden she was diagnosed with a glioblastoma, an absolutely terminal brain tumor at the age of 66. And I went to Canada to take care of her. I was married with 3 very young children for what was, I knew, going to be the last summer of her life. And my mother was a really social person. She threw parties. She was a fabulous natural cook who never needed to consult a recipe. And so I had dinner parties almost every night for my mother. She was very open about the fact that she was dying. She wanted to say goodbye to people. And my mother made a fine pie. And she had never taught me how to make pie, but I discovered, as one does, that I had been around it so long that I knew how to make the pie. So I began making pie every single night that summer of my mother's dying. It was an oddly comforting thing to roll out the dough. I have continued to find it a comforting, a kind of meditation. And my mother's friends would say to me after these dinner parties, first they said, "We're going to miss your mother," but then they said, "We're going to miss her pie. Could you give us the recipe?" I bet you weren't expecting such a long answer, but this is important. And as the bakers in this room know, every recipe for pie crust is pretty much the same. It would be not recommended that you try one today in this room, incidentally. You want your butter cold. It's how you handle the dough. And so the only way to teach these friends of my mother's how to make pie was to make pie with them. And I began to make pie with my mother's friends. And I made a lot of pies that summer. She died in October of that year. My marriage also ended, not coincidentally, in October of that year. I was suddenly without mother or father or marriage, and Thanksgiving was coming, and I didn't have any family to go to. My children were going to go off with their dad, and I decided to throw a pie party. And this might sound a little pathetic, but actually it was fine. It was fun. I invited all the people who were going to Thanksgivings to come to my house, and I would help them make their family pie. And that became the beginning of a tradition that's gone on now for over 30 years of teaching pie. I used to do it just with my friends, and then we would have this parade to the Keene soup kitchen to deliver our pies. And when I moved to California and I didn't really know anybody, I started teaching pie to raise money for candidates. So, and we would say, dough for Obama or dough for whoever. So by my reckoning, I've taught about 1,500 people how to make a pie. And many of the metaphors, like don't overhandle the dough, as every good baker knows, do apply to writing as well.
A member of the audience asks, what influence has your Jewish heritage had on you and your work?
Oh, so interesting. And it's so interesting to be asked that question in a Unitarian church. My father, technically I am Jewish by the laws of Israel. I'm the daughter of a Jewish mother, and some of you know the rules, no doubt. But I felt I was in a no person's land. My father came from this intensely Christian Bible, only book Bible background. Even though he had left it, it was still deeply ingrained in him. My mother came from a very culturally Jewish family, but in a time when in New Hampshire there was very little Jewish culture. And I had nothing. So what did I do? Unitarian church, of course. I missed, more than I knew at the time, I missed the sense of heritage and tradition. And I think it was only after my mother's death that I acknowledged that I identified myself not as half Jewish, but as a Jewish woman. But that said, I can't pretend to be able to speak the prayers in Hebrew. I don't have that in me. And I think I will always carry the sense of being neither one nor the other, which is actually what most writers are. They are outsiders. They are observers. You can't be fully at the party if you're going to be writing about the party. But I do like being in this pulpit, I have to say. You might never get me out of here.
A member of the audience asks, do you have advice for someone considering writing their story? And do you have advice on how they choose memoir or fiction?
Yes. I do have a little bit of advice. And it's hard to say just a little on this topic that is so important to me. But the first I will say is read. Read good memoir. And the next I will say is do not feel that you need to tell every single thing that happened. A good memoir is not the story of what happened. It's what it meant. And very often that can be told in surprisingly few words. I happen to be a lover of the personal essay, and when I work with writers in my workshops, I always encourage them to begin not with this pretty overwhelming task of, well, I was born, and then every other thing that happened. There are so many stories in our lives. At Home in the World is not the story of my life. It's the story of one particular arc of my life, which was me going from good girl, secret keeper, feeling a need to define herself by the approval of others, to somebody who was profoundly disapproved of by telling the story that I was forbidden to tell. The Best of Us is, once again, not the story of everything of my life. It is actually the story of how I learned at the age of 59 what it was to be married. And that really was the first time that it was only, not when I got married, but that's part of what this book is about, when I recognized that I would very likely lose my husband, that I came to understand what it meant to be part of a couple. So decide which story you're going to tell before you tell it. And the story is not my life, my family, my experiences in my profession, parenthood, marriage, home. It is choosing which of the many journeys you have gone on you want to tell this time around. And it doesn't have to be the last time either. It's one of the things that I tend to find when I work with a writer who hasn't been doing what I have, which is telling her story pretty consistently for 50 plus years, that they feel it's as if the house is on fire and their laptop is going to die, and this is the one moment that they'll ever have to get everything out, and it just pours out. Slow down and choose one story. I'm actually seeing in the back of the room a writing student that I worked with just recently I do a 3-day workshop in New Hampshire every summer, and we found one fabulous story for her to tell. And in the course of telling that story, of course, we got to know many other parts about who she was. Tell one, I would say, and then unblinkingly tell the truth. And if you can't tell the truth, then look at, people always say, write about what you know. But there's a corollary to that, which is write about what you don't know yet that you want to find out. When I was at McDowell, just down the road, during this glorious residency, when I started and finished my novel Labor Day, I was actually kind of stuck. I was in my last days at McDowell. I'd written 400 pages of a book that just wasn't working. I had 12 days left, and I couldn't bear to go home from McDowell without having created a book. And I thought about an experience that had happened to me quite a few years before, when a man in prison wrote me a series of letters, and they were extraordinary letters. And they came at a very vulnerable time in my life, when I was newly divorced, my mother newly dead, living as a single mother in New Hampshire, raising 3 children on my own. And this was a very dark and ultimately terrifying experience, the man in prison writing to me. When I was at McDowell, I revisited that experience, and I thought, what if, I could have written that as the true story, and in fact I did do it as an essay at one point, but what if the man was a different kind of man than the man really had been? What if that man escaped from prison and found his way to a lonely single mother in a small New Hampshire town, like this one? What might happen then if he holed up while the entire police force of the tri-state area was looking for him, and they fell in love? And that did become my novel Labor Day, which ultimately became a really pretty good movie. I recommend it, called Labor Day, starring Kate Winslet and Josh Brolin, who incidentally makes pie in that movie. These are all the ways where your obsessions sort of rework themselves into your writing. So there is, in the movie Labor Day, there is the sexiest pie scene ever, I'm going to say. And I'm very proud to say that Josh Brolin was an excellent pie student. I taught him everything he knew, and his pie is pretty much my pie. When my children went to see that movie, one of them actually stood up and said, "That's Mom's pie." My pie tastes delicious. Nobody's ever argued with that, but my pie looks a little funky, and it actually does look like it was made by a convict on the run, so it was very appropriate.
The writer observes everything, and so the writer seldom rests. How do you find quiet moments and prioritize mindfulness, even while you observe and collect material in your everyday life?
I love this question, Corinne, and I have to say, I don't. It is completely integrated. And I have never, people will say to me things like, have a good weekend, as if the weekend is a different kind of day from any other. I'm always thinking about stories. That's the bad news and the good news, because I love thinking about stories. So when I'm swimming in Dublin Lake or across Lake Whittemore, where my house is, I'm thinking about my stories, and I wouldn't wish it any other way. I think we have about 2 more minutes, and I would love to share with you just a couple of paragraphs from the very end of The Best of Us. I'll pick up with, I mentioned that after my husband's death, I decided that I wanted to come home to New Hampshire. I bought a little summer cottage that was kind of beat up, but in the best possible way, not at all modernized. I bought it sight unseen, and flew to New Hampshire after my husband's death. And this is just as the car pulls up and I set down my suitcase. That July day, a week after Jim left the planet, when Danny first brought me to the little cottage that I'd bought during the last months of my husband's life, I lifted my suitcase out of the car and set it down on the grass, pausing for a minute to take in the lake before heading inside. I looked out across the water as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the trees on the other side. Somewhere, a child was calling out to her mother. A couple paddled a kayak to no particular destination. I had been such a person once, a woman in the front of the boat with the man I loved behind me steering our craft. We cut smoothly through the water, matching the strokes of each other's paddles. I climbed the steps of the porch. The previous owners had taken the rocking chairs, but I'd buy another one. I put the key in the lock, stepped in the door, breathed in the smell of an old New Hampshire summer cottage. Through the windows, late afternoon sun streamed in. I could see the water dappling in the places where the trout came up to feed. How Jim would have loved this, I said. If he were here with me, he'd light a cigar on the porch and rest his feet on the railing. He'd watch as I walked down to the water, and he would keep his eyes on me until I reached the shore again, my guard dog. And after, over a good meal, we'd have many things to tell each other. What happens to those things, I asked myself, when there is no longer anyone to tell? But there is you. It was just me now, a woman with her laptop, wearing a blue and white checked flannel shirt to keep her warm on chilly nights that used to belong to her husband, looking up at the constellations whose names she tries to remember and sometimes does, though from this hemisphere, the Magellanic Cloud was not in evidence. One solitary woman and one solitary loon. Every night that summer, from where I slept in the boathouse down by the water, I heard his long, mournful cry. Somewhere out there, at the other side of the shore, maybe, her mate would call out to her. Every morning, just as the sun came up, I'd stand at the water's edge for a moment, then dive in. Thank you so much. And if you've been thinking that you have a story that you want to tell, I hope you'll dive into.
Thank you so much, Joyce Maynard, for sharing your time and expertise with us. We hope you have enjoyed today's live broadcast of the Monadnock Summer Lyceum. Thank you for your support of our 2022 season. Please join us next week to hear Maggie Fogarty talking about Immigrant Justice Delayed, Human Rights Denied, Finding a Way Forward. Now please join us for an informal reception in the Parish Hall through the door to my right, and there you will have the opportunity to engage in further conversation with our speaker and enjoy cold drinks. Please do respect social distancing when approaching our bookseller and our speaker. Thank you so much.